My next guest is Matt McGee. Matt is the founder of MRM Education, an elite tutoring and college admissions consultancy that emphasizes academic curiosity and confidence in students with the ultimate goal of admission into a top university. His 15-year career has included private tutoring, special education, and admissions consulting before founding MRM Education in 2020. His student-first approach and intensive peer-adjacent mentorship method has helped thousands of students raise their grades and gain admission to Ivy Plus schools. In 2024, he founded MRM Academy, a fully virtual one-on-one school for families desiring to customizable and flexible education options for their child. He's a member of the National Association for College Admissions Counseling. Well, welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Dana.
Well, let's dive in and tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Yeah, so God, I can remember 2020, I had been working for a tutoring company. And at this point, I had been tutoring for a while, but things had just kind of gone online. And I was doing private, like supplemental tutoring, so students who needed support with English and history. And the company I was working for, they also had an online school. And they came to me and they said, hey, with the pandemic going on, there's an extra need for kids who are actually taking courses with us. Would you be interested in doing this? And I said, yeah, sure. Extra hours. That sounds great. So they said, great. We have 2 students. We want to send you, we'll send you over the info, but like you're confirmed, did all the scheduling and whatnot. So a couple days later, the student file comes through, which has all their kind of like their info, what subject they're doing, what their schedule is, what they need, everything like that. And the 2 students who came across, one was a student who had a number of physical issues. And so she had formed a degree of anxiety around school and teachers that made her sometimes go nonverbal. And so her parents had pulled her out of school so that she could kind of get the education she needed. And the other student was a student who was autistic. And at this point, I had 0 experience or training in working with students with special education. And I remember having the email open to them saying, I don't have any special education experience, right? And I thought 2 things. I thought, one, I don't really have the financial freedom to be able to turn down these extra hours in these courses. And I thought, 2, if they're sending me these cases, it's not as though there's another special educator out there who's better than I am, who they just said, we're not going to send it to him. Let's give it to the less experienced person, right? It occurred to me that they were giving these students to me because I was their best option. And so for those 2 reasons, I said, you know what, we'll figure it out. We'll go, we'll do it. Okay. So the next 2 semesters were what I would describe as being in the trenches. It was a lot of reaching out to teachers who I knew who were in the classroom, who had experience with special education, or, having them put me in touch with their colleagues who had been in special education. It was a lot of research and understanding how to approach these students. And frankly, it was just a whole lot of failing with these 2 students, to the point where, a lot of the things that I knew as an educator and the way that I approach students just simply would not work with these students. To the point where, a number of times the student with anxiety would shut down on me, to the point where we would lose entire sessions of neither of us speaking because I didn't want to push her further over the edge. But I could tell that she was anxious and she was uncomfortable. The student who had autism had, as is common with autism, very, very stringent and strict beliefs. And I was teaching him a history course.
Yeah.
So you're in a situation where you're trying to kind of deal with that belief system. And again, a big part of what I try and teach students is not what to think, but how to, especially when you're approaching history.
Yeah.
And so navigating a situation in which someone is going to take every factual event and they're going to take it and immediately apply their belief system on it And I'm going, every ounce of me as an educator is going, no, that's not where we want to go. But also realizing that that's going to trigger what's going on with him.
Sure.
It was a whole thing. And it wound up being that in one of the cases, I was able to approach this and figure out kind of how to connect with her. And in the other case, I just wound up not being the right person. And it was unfortunate because, he lost that time, right? And I did the best that I could, but ultimately I just wasn't prepared to deal with that situation.
Mhm.
Uh, and so what I think the whole experience kind of taught me was it's no secret that on the public side of things, there is a dearth of resources to go into special education. But I think we look at the private side of things and go, well, there are all these resources. There are wealthy families who have money to spend with insurance and whatnot.
Mhm.
Um, but even in this situation, I realized it's going on the private side too, where these companies are taking in people who they don't necessarily have the capability to support and sort of patching something together to try and get these kids the education they need.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, those are larger systematic issues. Sometimes students who are on the spectrum or who have special needs, maybe they haven't been identified and gone through the IEP process, and they could be in middle school already, and then they're having these, reading difficulties or whatever subject it may be. So parents find tutoring, and it's kind of that systematic issue, like you said, either they're not getting what they need at the school they're enrolled in. Maybe the traditional school isn't the place that's best for them. So they're more learning at home and online, but also finding a tutor who's able to support them. Like you said, you failed forward, realizing eventually that one student, maybe you weren't best suited to tutor him, but you did try your best.
Yeah, and it's really kind of all we can do, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so you work a lot with students who are college bound. So first of all, let's talk about those neurodiverse students who, have ADHD, ADD, who are on the spectrum, dysgraphia, dyslexia, anything that falls into neurodiversity. So what are some of the things that teachers need to know, their classroom teachers, maybe their school counselors, that you would like to say here on the podcast, working with a lot of these students in your company?
Yeah, I think the huge thing is like you can approach, when it comes to college admissions, if you know how to kind of like comport your narrative or your experience, you can make almost anything work to your advantage. And I look at students who have any sort of neurodivergence as, we sort of treat it as like, oh, that's, we pity them, right? We go like, oh, that's so, how brave of you to overcome that. But it's such a beautiful thing to be able to it's such a beautiful thing to be able to kind of put into your application as not just like this thing I overcame, but this thing that is a part of me. It's such an interesting thing because when we talk about special education, a lot of times we want to use like person-focused language. What we say is person-focused language before disability-focused language. So
Mhm.
you're a person with disabilities, not a disabled person. The autistic community actually kind of eschews that and goes, we want to be referred to as autistic people because being autistic is a social experience, right? And it sort of like relates to how we relate to the rest of the world. And and that is sort of what we're trying to hit at, right? So in the situation where I was working with an autistic student who is now at Berkeley, right? He was in a situation where he was so interested in fish and wildlife that he had discovered a new type of fish that was existing on a state park near where he lived.
Mhm.
And he was the only person who said, these type of trout, they normally go to the ocean, but these haven't gone to the ocean, but they're still the same. And he figured that out.
Mhm.
So, his grades weren't necessarily Berkeley grades, but he was still able to get in because we sort of took that and we said, okay, you have this like highly focused interest, which
Mhm.
translates to this, this really interesting experience that you had. Now let's take that and push forth with that. And I think if guidance counselors are doing that, I mean, teachers are less so involved in that process. But if guidance counselors look at it more and say, hey, we have this thing that we're dealing with, how can we turn this into a positive versus how can we manage our expectations and say, you know, are you really going to excel at a top school? Maybe you should go to a state school, or maybe you should go to community college. I think that we should be looking at neurodivergence as the advantage that it really can be.
Yeah, and just seeing like students that take interest into something like he did and were hyper focused and maybe built something, worked with STEM, or did anything that we don't see necessarily on those college applications of the students who were involved in all these extracurricular activities, because a lot of our autistic students don't really want to be so social, but like if they're taking that special interest into a topic and researching it and going above and beyond because they're so hyper focused on it, like you said, that is a superpower as well.
It really is.
So a lot of the students that you receive in your tutoring company, they are struggling in school at the secondary level, and parents bring them in. Sometimes the kids are already high achieving. So how does your company work with some of these students that are often resistant to getting tutoring?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because you have, I think since the beginning of time, you have had students who are not engaged in their academics or coursework or what have you. Um, and I think it's one of the mistakes that we make when it comes to tutoring, where we say, my child is struggling in biology, so let's get them a biology expert. I think that's a huge mistake. It can sometimes work. But oftentimes it doesn't really kind of like get at the issue, which I think so often is what you're speaking to, is like a lack of engagement, right? Students aren't engaged. And I think follow the traditional public school model of, one teacher and 20 students. The math is going to tell you there that at least a few of them are not going to be engaged, right? There's no way that teacher is going to be able to hold 20 students' attention for 180 days a year for, an hour a day.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. And I think we wrongly attribute this as educators. We go like, he's lazy, she's lazy, right? She's a bad student, and we put it on them. But it's sort of ridiculous to say we have an adult in a situation and we have a child in a situation, and we're now going to put it on the child as it's their problem. To me, it's, as we as educators have to kind of assume that. And so when it comes to us working with students, the first thing above everything else is to get them engaged. I think you read it in the bio, is right. One of our core values as a company is to try and build like academic curiosity. And that's really where it's at, is that we're not just trying to get you a better grade in biology. We want to kind of like bring you back into appreciating education. We want to get you back into engagement in the classroom. And if we can do those two things, then your grade will inevitably rise. Because if you're interested in the subject matter you're learning, you're going to get better. And so I think the approach we have is it's twofold. One, it goes into like bringing on a certain type of tutor who's not just an expert in a field, but who is like a highly charismatic, interesting person. And then two, also making the match. And I think it gets kind of like bandied about in the tutoring industry of, we're going to find the perfect match for you. But again, I think that boils down to, we're going to find an expert for you in the subject that you're struggling in, and they're going to be a college professor, and you're going to be impressed by their resume. When the real key is, what is your personality type? What kind of learning style do you have? Do you want somebody who's going to have an active approach to teaching you? Do you want somebody who's going to have a more passive, straightforward approach? And finding that. And so that really is kind of where we sit in trying to develop that engagement and that intellectual curiosity.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into just in the terms of hiring tutors. Like you said, you could find somebody who has worked as a college professor or who's retired. Like I said, my dad has worked tutoring, and he worked with engineering. So somebody who could tutor math and science, who knows the facts, but some of those people don't always know how to connect with the students. So, what do you look for often in terms of tutors and how they, you have some tutors that like are active and ones that are passive. Is that something that you ask your families as well when they're signing up for tutoring? Like what, how much involvement would you like your tutors to have? Those types of things.
I mean, it's a fully comprehensive thing. What kind of,
Yeah.
how do you think your child, if the child is old enough, I'm
Yeah.
going to try and meet with the child, or I'm going to have one of our counselors meet with the child so that we can have an idea of what their personality is. Because,
Sure.
a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old can advocate for themselves and say, I like this type of person. Um, but it's a fully comprehensive thing. What kind of a tutor are you looking for? A lot of times it comes down to gender. A lot of times it comes down to, how old or young they are. If they're a younger student, a lot of times the family will be, well, they had, Miss Raimundo in second grade and they really loved her and she was a middle-aged woman. So we would love to go that route. So it winds up being very comprehensive. Um, but ultimately, I think like when I'm looking to hire somebody, obviously the first bar you have to clear is that you know the subject, right? That is
Mhm.
obviously the bare bones of it. But from there, it comes to a place of, are you charismatic? Can you
Mhm.
hold a conversation? Are you likable? Can I see that you're able to take somebody that you've never met before and connect with them at least relatively quickly? Because all the expertise is not going to do me an ounce of good if I have no desire to listen to you.
Yeah.
Uh, so it sounds very kind of uh, I'll say casual, but a big test is, are you cool? Do I enjoy being around you? And when you work with us, you go through a couple of interviews so that it's not just kind of like my test of do I like you?
Yeah.
Uh, because going back to your point, you could be the greatest teacher in the world who connects with 98% of your students, and 98% of your students go, Mr. Smith is the best teacher I've ever had. He's amazing.
Mhm.
And there's 2% who are going like, yeah, I didn't get much out of that class. And if I pair you with Mr. Smith, then you're not getting anything out of your tutoring. And so it's a huge part of understanding that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and like you said, it could also have to do the popularity. Like the students had a sibling who had this particular tutor as well, and
Absolutely.
wants the other sibling to work with that tutor. But yeah, and I think it's also a good. Let's kind of we're going to talk a little bit about peer tutoring, but um, let's kind of segue into that. Like, you take people who are already established tutors or educators, but also you've worked a little bit, like I said in the bio, with peer tutoring and maybe using uh, it's high school students who are honor students or college students who are work study programs. And these could be options for families who are lower income, who cannot afford the rate that a lot of the tutoring companies are charging.
Yeah, so I mean the whole peer and near peer, or I like to call it peer adjacent, to me sounds
Yeah.
best. It's a really effective thing. As far as um college prep, for example, it's one of the methods we use whereby we take students who are they have just graduated college,
Mhm.
and their job is to work with the students we take on who are applying to college, whether they're freshmen and they're earlier in their journey, or they're, juniors and seniors and they're getting the applications together. They essentially have like a buddy who kind of walks them through, who has just dealt with it and has also been highly successful in the process. And what that does is it just gives an 18-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old this feeling that like I'm getting information from somebody who gets it.
Mhm.
Because, and this goes back to what we were talking about just a second ago, is like, you get this guy who's a former admissions officer at Stanford or at Johns Hopkins, and he's
Yeah.
65 and he has all this information, useful information, but you're not listening to it because like, what do I have to learn from this guy?
Yeah.
So initially I found the peer thing to be very successful in the college prep model. In the tutoring model, it I think it's a fantastic option to have college students coming in to tutor high school students in some sort of a work study program that allows college students to either get paid or credit to work with these students, because tutoring is just like you said, it's out of control. The prices are increasing and they're going up and up and up. And um, college students, although they are busy and although they aren't full experts, again, you automatically have a degree of trust built in when the age is close.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and so it's a really fantastic option that I think not enough schools really take advantage of in that it could benefit both the college students and the high school students.
Mhm. So we talked a little bit in the pre-chat about schools that have a high number of students on free and reduced lunches. And, you know, some of these schools do have the teachers stay after for tutoring, or some of the paras do tutoring. But what are some ways that you can think of just to make it more affordable, or maybe free for some of these students whose families cannot afford it? And something that you're doing as well, you talked about a ratio for scholarships.
Yeah, so we have a 4-to-1, which works across college prep and tutoring, where we say every 4 hours we work with students who are paying. We do 1 hour of work with student who just needs the support. And that comes either through applications or through teachers who say, they've like recommended students to us and they say, this student needs help. We have a number of ways of grasping those. Um, but I think the real crux of it comes down to investment, in that there should be more options that the school gives these families, right? In the idea that, like, we speak to say, well, the parents can help is to me almost asinine and antagonistic,
Yeah,
as though these people are not already working 9 to 5, maybe more than that. And the fact that they're not experts in this,
yeah.
some of these are immigrant families. So what, you want them to teach, English? And as this student gets into a higher level, they're going to teach AP Lit, like it's not feasible. So I
Mhm.
think, one, going back to having the institutions, the colleges and the primary schools, the secondary schools as well, engage with each other on having programs that will benefit both their students. Because again, this wouldn't just benefit the students who are being tutored, but students in college who are looking to pay their way through because maybe they're not on scholarship and they don't necessarily have the financial aid.
Mhm.
It's a fantastic option for them, and it's still serving the same low income communities. Private companies like my own, a number of them do have foundations, but a lot of them just simply don't. And that would be another way to approach it. But I think the main thing is getting the institutions to go on it. I know in any time that we've tried to kind of explore working with an institution, the approach to me is very much in terms of cost effectiveness, right?
Mhm.
It's all about the amount of dollars per head. And it winds up sort of like dehumanizing the students in a way that says, well, you're actually just a number. You're
Mhm.
actually worth X amount of dollars per. And I get that, the administrators that I'm working with in that situation are really also just dealing with a numbers game, right? They're dealing with I
Yeah,
have this amount of money to spend. And so I think it comes back to, at a higher level, federal legislation, state legislation, to say we need to start investing in the schools again, as cliche as that sounds, because until you put that investment in, you're not going to get any return out. And you're wondering why we're seeing, voucher programs, why we're seeing students leaving public schools in record numbers, why we're seeing more and more homeschooling happening, because there isn't that investment. And I'm not sure if it's because we don't think it's worth it. I'm not sure if we just don't want to spend the money or what it is. But, it's incumbent on us to realize that the investment we put in now is the one that pays off today as we educate the people who are going to be driving the economy tomorrow.
yeah, yeah. No, I think it is a systematic issue as well, in terms of just, what some of the schools do with some of the fundings that they get to maybe hold the after school tutoring and or family outreach and those types of things. But actually, being that place where they can support students who need the support, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's hiring paras, or more staff who can work with the students in small groups or one-on-one.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, like you said, it's not everybody who students who can take the time necessarily for tutoring if they're involved in sports, or parents who know their student might need tutoring if they're really busy with their job, or we don't want to wait until it's too late. And I think just from some of the students that I've had for probably the past 10 years, there's a lot of students who, at the end of the semester they realize they're failing, or somewhere along the way they have all these missing assignments.
Yeah. I mean, and the I think it was your last guest that actually had spoken about improving relations between parents and the schools, right? Because there were these parents finding out at the end of the semester, oh, by the way, you've got an F, there's nothing you can do about it now.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time. And yeah, I think that's a bigger problem in the lower income schools than it is in the wealthier areas or the private schools. But yeah, that early intervention is kind of a huge part of it. Unfortunately for us, there's little that we can do in that situation until that issue has been diagnosed. I think it's one of the areas where we try and work with learning specialists as much as possible, because then the learning specialists will sort of ping us and they'll say, they're working with the student, realizing that something needs to happen. If they haven't brought in the parents, they will still ping us saying, hey, I have this student, and now there is an alert, right? Now there is another adult who has been brought in to say, there's an issue here.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about students applying to college, and the students who are neurodiverse, what they can put on their application that'll help them stand out. But also in terms of students who are just preparing for that high school resume, let's say their college application, there is you look beyond their GPA, look beyond the SAT scores. What is something they need to be cognizant of as they bring forth that narrative and write their college admissions essay?
Yeah, I mean, you really got to think about it from the terms of your college application is not just a collection of numbers and activities on a sheet. It's a story, right? It's the story of you up until this point, and then you're kind of telling the university that you want them to be the next chapter. And so the key is to make sure that whatever you're doing is to kind of think about the way that those things connect to each other. Think about the way that those things thematically link to each other. In the example of the autistic student I was talking to you about before with the fish that he discovered, his application was all about wildlife, and his application was all about land and life out in the state park. That's what he was very interested in. And so I always tell students, you're telling a university that you want to study X to become Y to solve Z, right? And so you want the university to just see how you flow, and you want them to see what you've done and where it is you're going. And so everything you do should be all about being in that story, that through line, that narrative. And that doesn't mean go out and do things just to get into college, but that means get involved in things that you're interested in, get involved in things that you love, and figure out and be cognizant of on the way, not just, oh, I'm doing this because I like it, but be cognizant of how this really speaks to you as a person. And if you're able to kind of I don't know if it's like a cloud map of words or word map, whatever they call it, and you start to think of your own themes and writing them down and kind of tracing it through that. But it's just knowing how exactly all the things you do add up to being able to share your story with the university that you want to go to.
And I would assume, since you are working with a lot of kids who are working on this narrative, it's not necessarily a one session type thing, because they haven't really thought about this a lot of the time. And sometimes it does take several sessions to get them to think about that narrative, right?
It takes a while, right? There, a lot of these kids are 14 and 15 years old, and they're really kind of learning this for the first time. And a lot of students are under the impression that I just need to do as many extracurriculars under the sun, or I need to do this program and that program and another program. And it's really not necessarily about that. And there is a lot that you can take away from one session. I think A lot of the families that necessarily can't make the financial investment go, give me one session. We try and give them as much as we can, give them a roadmap, and then, they're off.
Mhm.
But yes, with students like this, I mean, sometimes you get parents that are coming to you and they're like, my student is going into middle school next year. We have to think about college. And I kind of have to go, maybe let the kid be a kid for a little while.
Yeah.
Uh, but oftentimes I think like eighth, ninth grade is when you really want to start thinking about this. And that doesn't mean that your whole life should be about this. Um, but that's where you really want to start thinking about what that story is and understanding that your college application is really sort of about forming that narrative.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind for those working with students, eighth grade and up. Well, we've had a great conversation today, talking about preparing kids for the college admissions process, for parents to find the perfect tutor, also a little bit about peer and peer adjacent tutoring. Out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
We've talked a lot about a lot of things. I think almost one point that I don't think we did talk about that I think I want anyone that I work with to take away, and I speak to both parents and students when I say this, is don't sacrifice your entire life to be academically successful. Don't sacrifice your entire life to get into Harvard or MIT. Live your life. Be a person. Don't be so anxious. Life goes on. If you don't get into, the one Ivy League that you've been dying to go to, life goes on. If your GPA drops below 4 point into a 3.9, or you got a 1550 instead of a 1600 on the SAT. When you make your entire life revolve around academics and trying to be the perfect student, it winds up backfiring because
Yeah.
you wind up being this uninteresting person who's burned out, who doesn't have the ability to really know who they are. And so the greatest advice that I can give parents and students is take a deep breath, do what you really enjoy doing. Make sure that you follow the advice of your teachers and your counselors and the people who are around you, but do not make this your end all be all. What school you ultimately go to or what GPA you graduate with is not going to be the determining factor for the rest of your life. If you are a capable, interesting, engaged person, you will wind up on top and successful at the end, no matter where you go to school.
Yeah, it's really important to have our young people remember. Well, where can people connect with you and find you online?
Yeah, for sure. So if they're on Instagram, they can find me at MRM Education or my personal account at Matt McGee _Ed Consulting. And you can also find us on the website at mrmeducation.com.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure having you on the Out of the Trenches podcast today to talk about tutoring, talking about some of the things parents can help their students with, but also where to look for tutors and how to prepare students for college. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. It was a pleasure.